The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. My name is Ren Ostrich, and I have spent 11 years reading light and static for the Vithara Dominion. That night, sitting alone in the border listening post above the dead moon of Callis Station, I watched a single red dot appear on my screen where nothing should have been. No registered vessel, no transponder code, no matching signature in any file I had access to. At first I assumed it was an error. Sensor ghosts happen more often than anyone admits. A stray particle, a solar flare, a piece of corrupted code repeating itself in a loop. I ran the standard checks. The dot did not disappear. It did not blink or stutter the way false readings usually do. It held steady, moving through the outer dark at a speed my instruments refused to calculate properly. Every time I asked the system for a velocity reading, it returned a number, deleted it, and tried again, as if it could not believe its own answer. I called it in anyway. That is the part of this story I am still proud of, even now, even after everything that came after. I flagged the contact and sent it up the chain, marked urgent, requesting a second station confirm what I was seeing. The response came back within the hour, and it was not what I hoped for. Commander Yeshel Dorn, my section supervisor, read my report with the particular tired patience of a man who has heard 100 junior officers claim they found a monster in the noise. He told me, kindly enough, that sensor drift near the Callies debris field was well documented. He told me that new analysts often mistake old equipment problems for something dramatic. He told me to log the anomaly as unresolved and move on to my other duties. I did not argue. You do not argue with a commander 12 ranks above you when the only evidence you have is a dot that will not behave. But I kept a private log that night, something I was not required to do, something that later became the only true record of what actually happened before the Dominion understood what it was dealing with. In my private log I wrote this: the object shows no drive signature we recognize. It shows no heat bloom consistent with any known engine class. It is not decelerating as it approaches populated space, and yet it is not accelerating either. It behaves as though speed itself means something different to whatever built it. I did not sleep well after that entry. 3 days later, the dot crossed the outer boundary of the Cenis corridor, a quiet trade route we kept lightly patrolled with a rotating picket fleet. 6 ships, nothing large, nothing built for real conflict, just enough presence to remind smugglers and rival powers that the Dominion still claimed the space. Their commanding officer was a woman named Ilsa Grath, someone I had exchanged messages with twice before over unrelated supply requests. She was steady, unremarkable, exactly the kind of officer you want holding a quiet border post. Nothing about her service record suggested she would become part of the reason an entire empire changed its understanding of the universe. I was monitoring the corridor feed when the 6 ships registered the same unidentified contact I had flagged days earlier. I remember leaning closer to my screen, my hand hovering over the comm switch, some old instinct telling me to warn them, though warn them of what, I could not have said. There was nothing hostile in the data, no weapons charge, no aggressive maneuver. The unknown ship was simply present, drifting toward the picket line with the same strange, patient motion it had shown from the very beginning. Grath's fleet moved to intercept, standard procedure, nothing more than a formality. I watched 6 response beacons blink steady on my display, showing normal status, normal chatter, someone even joking over open comms about finally getting to see the ghost ship everyone in the sector had started talking about. Then the feed changed. I do not have a better way to describe what happened next than to say the 6 beacons simply stopped. Not one at a time, not in the staggered rhythm of a fight where ships fall in sequence as damage accumulates. All 6, together, within a window of time so short my display initially logged it as a single event rather than 6 separate ones. 90 seconds. That is the number I keep returning to. 90 seconds between full contact and total silence. I sat there for a long moment doing nothing at all. My hands had gone cold. The comm channel that had carried casual jokes only minutes before now carried nothing, not even static, just the flat, empty tone of a connection with no one left to answer it. I tried hailing Grath directly. No response. I tried the fleet's secondary channel, then the emergency band reserved for catastrophic failure. Nothing came back on any of them. The unknown contact, meanwhile, continued along its original course, unbothered, unchanged, as though the 6 ships that had just vanished from every channel I owned had never been more than a minor obstacle in its path, barely worth acknowledging. I remember standing up from my console and walking to the observation window of the station, though there was nothing to see out there but the same distant stars that had always been there. I needed to move. I needed to do something with my body because my mind had stopped being useful to me. When I returned to my seat, I filed the most urgent report of my career. I did not soften the language this time. I did not hedge my conclusions to avoid sounding dramatic. I wrote plainly that a full picket fleet under experienced command had gone silent in under 2 minutes against a single, unarmed-looking vessel that had not fired a single visible shot, and that whatever explanation existed for this, it was not sensor drift, and it was not old equipment, and it was not something I was willing to let another commander wave away with a tired smile. This time, no one told me to log it and move on. Word spread through the sector command structure faster than I expected. Within hours, my report had been pulled by officers well above my pay grade, then by analysts from the Central Strategic Office, then, I later learned, by someone on the Dominion Council itself. I had never been so quickly promoted to relevance in my life, and I found no comfort in it at all. I requested permission to travel to the Cenis corridor myself, to see the wreckage, if there was any wreckage to see, with my own eyes rather than through second-hand reports filtered through officers who had not watched 6 beacons vanish from a screen in real time. My request was approved faster than any request I had ever filed before. That alone told me how seriously things had shifted in the space of a single evening. Before I left the listening post, I sat for a while longer at my console, staring at the dot that had started all of it. It was gone from my display now, moved on past the range of my station's sensors, continuing wherever it intended to go, indifferent to the fear it had left behind it. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that we had been treating this as a mystery to solve, the way you solve a puzzle or a broken piece of equipment. I remember realizing, as I packed my travel case that night, that it was not a puzzle at all. It was a warning, and we had almost missed it entirely, and somewhere out in that quiet corridor, 6 good officers who had trusted the systems they served were never going to answer a comm channel again. I did not know yet what had truly happened to Ilsa Grath and her crew. No one did. That answer was still waiting for me, out among the drifting wreckage of the Cenis corridor, and it would turn out to be far stranger and far more unsettling than the empty silence I had already listened to for far too long. The transport ship carrying me to the Cenis corridor was called the Aldrin, a modest vessel built for supply runs rather than investigations, and its crew treated the assignment with the same nervous energy I felt in my own chest. No one spoke much during the 3-day journey. I spent most of it reviewing the last transmissions from Grath's fleet, listening again and again to the final 30 seconds of casual conversation before the silence took over, searching for some detail I might have missed the first time. There was nothing to find in the audio. That was, in its own way, the most disturbing part. Whatever happened to those 6 ships happened too quickly and too completely to leave behind any warning at all. When the Aldrin finally dropped out of transit space, at the edge of the corridor, the pilot brought us in slowly, cautious of debris fields that had not existed a week earlier. I stood at the forward viewport with 2 forensic officers assigned to the investigation, a quiet man named Colin Ray and a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Marion Blythe, both veterans of accident and battle site analysis. Neither of them had seen anything like what waited for us in that corridor, and within an hour, neither had I. The 6 ships of Grath's picket fleet hung motionless in the dark, spread across several kilometers of empty space, and even from a distance, something about their condition looked wrong in a way I could not immediately name. As we drew closer, the wrongness became specific. There were no explosion scars on the hulls, no weapon burns, no melted plating, none of the violent, chaotic damage that comes from sustained combat. Instead, each ship looked as though it had simply been opened, sections of hull pulled away or folded back with an almost careful precision, exposing the interior compartments to open space without the ragged edges you would expect from any weapon in the Dominion arsenal, or any weapon we had ever recorded from a rival power. Marion Blythe said very little as she reviewed the scans, which for her was unusual. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual confidence. "There is no blast pattern here," she said. "No thermal signature consistent with directed energy or projectile impact. Whatever did this did not explode these ships. It unmade them." Ray, standing beside her, added something I have never forgotten. He said that in 20 years of forensic work, he had grown used to violence leaving a signature, a fingerprint of force, that told you what kind of weapon had been used and how. This, he said, left no fingerprint at all, only the absence of the ship it used to be. We recovered the flight recorder from Grath's lead vessel 3 hours later, pulled carefully from the drifting wreck by a retrieval team in vacuum suits, working in silence because no one felt much like talking. Back aboard the Aldrin, we reviewed the data together in a cramped analysis room that suddenly felt too small for the three of us and the weight of what we were about to see. The recorder held 12 seconds of usable sensor data before the feed cut out entirely. In those 12 seconds, the unidentified vessel appeared on the Pickett Fleet's short-range scanners for the first time at close proximity, and the shape that emerged did not match anything in our records. It was not built along the lines of Dominion design, or the design of any of the 3 rival powers we tracked along our borders. It moved in ways that made no sense against everything I understood about thrust and inertia, shifting direction and position with a smoothness that suggested it was not fighting against physics the way every ship I had ever studied did, but working alongside something we did not yet understand. The recording ended abruptly, mid-frame, the last image frozen and grainy, showing only a fragment of hull and a strange, almost casual approach vector, as though the ship had not been rushing toward a fight at all, simply moving toward an outcome it already expected. We found one survivor. She had been ejected in an emergency pod moments before the final silence, thrown clear by an automated system rather than any deliberate choice, and she had drifted, unconscious, for nearly 4 days before a passing supply convoy picked up her weak distress beacon. Her name was Corin Hale, a junior technical officer on Grath's flagship, and when I was finally allowed to speak with her aboard the medical transport that had rescued her, she was still pale, still shaking faintly whenever the conversation drew close to what she had witnessed. She did not have much to tell me in terms of hard information. Her memory of the final moments was fragmented, the way memory often becomes under extreme stress, but one thing she said stayed with me long after I left her bedside. She said it did not feel like being attacked. She said it felt like being looked at, the way you might feel a stranger's gaze land on you across a crowded room, and that the ship never seemed to hurry, never seemed threatened by 6 vessels closing in around it, as though the outcome had never truly been in question. I asked her if she had seen any weapons fire directed at her ship. She said no. She said everything simply stopped working. The lights, the engines, the comms, all at once, gently, almost politely, and that the last thing she remembered before the escape pod fired was a strange, calm, quiet settling over the bridge, the kind of quiet that comes after a question has already been answered. I filed my findings with Dominion High Command 3 days later, alongside Ray and Blythe's forensic reports, and I did not try to soften any of it. I told them plainly that we were facing something outside our current understanding of weapons technology, something that did not rely on force in any way we could measure, and that whatever it was, it had disabled and destroyed a full Pickett fleet without appearing to try particularly hard. High Command's response was swift, and in hindsight, entirely predictable. Within a week, orders were issued to assemble a full battle group, built around the heavy cruiser Ashkeld and supported by a dozen escort vessels, with clear instructions to locate the unidentified contact, contain it, and neutralize it before it could reach any populated system within Dominion space. I was assigned to accompany the battle group as lead intelligence analyst, tasked with documenting the engagement and, if things went as expected, cataloging whatever remained of the mystery vessel once the Dominion's full military strength had answered the question that 6 lost ships and 1 traumatized survivor could not. I remember boarding the Ashkeld with a strange, uneasy feeling I could not quite place at the time. Looking back, I understand it now. Some part of me had already seen enough to suspect that this battle group, confident as it was, prepared as it was, might be walking toward the exact same silence that had swallowed Ilsa Grath and her crew, only on a much larger scale. I did not know yet how right that feeling would turn out to be. The Ashkeld was the largest ship I had ever served aboard, a heavy cruiser built to project Dominion strength across an entire sector, and standing on its bridge during the approach to the last known heading of the unidentified vessel, I understood for the first time just how much confidence a warship that size could carry into a fight. Captain Varen Thale commanded the battle group with the calm authority of someone who had never lost a real engagement, and his crew reflected that same steady certainty. In the mess hall the night before we expected contact, I overheard more than one joke about the ghost ship, about how 12 escort vessels and a cruiser the size of a small city would finally put an end to the stories spreading through the fleet. Nobody around me seemed afraid. I remember wishing I could share that feeling, and finding that I simply could not. We picked up the contact on long-range scanners 2 days into the search, exactly where projected models suggested it might reappear, moving through open space at that same unhurried pace I remembered from the corridor recordings. Captain Thale ordered the battle group into standard engagement formation, cruiser at the center, escorts spread wide to cut off any retreat. The ship did not retreat. It also did not advance, not in any aggressive sense. It simply held its position as our formation closed the distance, the way something might wait patiently for a conversation it already expected to have, and that stillness unsettled me more than any sudden maneuver could have. Thale gave the order to hail it first, standard procedure before any use of force, though I doubt anyone aboard the Ashkeld expected a response. None came, not in any language our systems recognized, not even a simple acknowledgement that the message had been received. After 3 attempts, Thale gave the order I had been dreading since the moment I boarded this ship: weapons free. The escort vessels opened fire first, a coordinated spread designed to overwhelm any single target regardless of its shielding capability. I watched the tactical display carefully, expecting to see the familiar collapse of enemy shields under sustained fire, the kind of predictable damage curve every combat simulation had trained me to recognize. Instead, I watched precise, powerful weapons fire simply fail to connect the way it should have. Shots that our targeting systems confirmed as direct hits registered no meaningful damage at all, as though the energy discharged against that hull simply dispersed into nothing. Stranger still, several shots that should have struck true according to every targeting solution our computers calculated instead missed entirely, deviating at the last possible moment in ways that made no sense given the physics involved. Blythe, standing beside me at the analysis station, muttered something I will not forget. She said it was almost as if the ship already knew where every shot would land before we fired it, and was simply choosing, calmly, not to be there when it arrived. 2 minutes into the engagement, the first escort vessel went dark, not destroyed in the traditional sense, not torn apart by weapons fire the way ships are meant to fall in a fight. Its systems simply stopped, all at once, the same gentle, total silence Corin Hale had described from the picket fleet's final moments. Then a second escort followed, then a third, each falling into that same eerie stillness within seconds of each other, drifting now, powerless, their crews unresponsive over every channel we tried. I remember Captain Thale's voice on the bridge, still steady, still giving orders, though I could hear something shifting underneath his composure, a recognition dawning that whatever we were facing did not behave the way an enemy was supposed to behave. By the 6th minute, 7 of our 12 escort vessels had gone silent, and the mystery ship had not moved from its original position by more than a few kilometers, as though it had not needed to chase anything at all, simply waiting for us to exhaust ourselves against something we could not properly touch. Thale finally ordered the Ashkeld itself into direct engagement, bringing the cruiser's full weapons array to bear, a level of firepower that Dominion doctrine considered more than sufficient to end almost any conceivable threat within our region of space. For a moment, something changed. The mystery ship shifted position for the first time since the engagement began, closing the distance toward the Ashkeld with a smooth, deliberate motion that felt less like an attack and more like a decision finally being made. Then the lights on the bridge flickered. I felt it before I understood it, a strange shift in the air, the low hum of the ship's systems faltering for just a moment before recovering. Around me, officers began calling out failures across a dozen different systems at once: navigation, weapons targeting, internal communications, each failure small on its own but accumulating with a speed that told me exactly where this was heading. Captain Thale ordered an immediate withdrawal, but by then the Ashkeld's main engines had already begun losing power, the ship drifting rather than retreating, and I understood, standing there on a bridge full of officers trying desperately to regain control of systems that no longer seemed to answer them, that the same silence which had taken Grath's picket fleet and now 7 of our escorts was closing in around us as well. Blythe grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the evacuation bay before I had fully processed what was happening, moving quickly through corridors filled with the low emergency lighting that meant a ship's crew had accepted the fight was already lost. We reached the escape pod bay along with a small group of surviving crew, and I remember Thale's voice over the emergency channel, calm even now, ordering all remaining personnel to evacuate immediately while he stayed behind to attempt one last transmission. I do not know what that transmission said. I never learned whether it was ever answered. The escape pod launched from the Ashkeld only moments before its own systems fell fully silent, and as our small vessel pulled away into open space, I turned to look back through the narrow viewport one final time, expecting to see nothing more than the drifting hulk of a defeated cruiser. Instead, in that brief moment before distance and debris obscured the view, I saw something along the hull of the mysterious ship that I have replayed in my memory countless times since, a marking, faint but unmistakable, etched near what might have been its forward section. Characters I did not recognize as belonging to any Dominion script or any language of the rival powers we tracked along our borders. It took our linguistic division nearly a full day after our rescue to confirm what I already suspected the moment I saw it. It was human writing, and somewhere in that quiet, drifting wreckage of an entire battle group, the Dominion's confident, controlled understanding of its place among the stars had just been permanently and completely undone. I was pulled into a closed session of the Dominion Council less than a week after our rescue, still recovering from the strange numbness that follows watching an entire battle group vanish in the space of a few short minutes. I had expected to spend that week writing reports in relative quiet. Instead, I found myself standing in a chamber I had only ever seen from a respectful distance, surrounded by senior officials who all seemed to be waiting for me to explain something I barely understood myself. Counselor Avith Sorn led the session, a woman known throughout the Dominion for her sharp questions and her low tolerance for uncertainty, and she wasted no time in asking me directly what I believed we were dealing with. I told her the truth, that I did not know, that everything I had witnessed defied the categories we normally use to measure a threat, and that the only solid piece of evidence we had was a fragment of writing on a hull that our linguistic division had identified as belonging to a species called humanity, a name that meant almost nothing to anyone in that room. It meant nothing because, until recently, it had not needed to. Humanity had only been logged in Dominion records a handful of years earlier, following a brief and uneventful border survey that classified them as a young, developing species, technologically modest, confined to a small number of systems, and considered no meaningful concern to anyone. I remember pulling up that old survey report myself the night before the session, reading through its calm, almost dismissive language, and feeling a strange chill at how confidently wrong it now appeared. During the council session, Fleet Intelligence finally succeeded in doing something no one had managed since this entire crisis began. They opened a working channel to the vessel itself. I was present in the room when the response came through, and I remember the silence that fell over everyone the moment a voice, calm, and unmistakably human, answered on the other end. It did not sound like the voice of something monstrous or triumphant. It sounded almost apologetic, mild in tone, the way someone might sound explaining a simple misunderstanding rather than announcing a victory. The voice belonged to a man who identified himself as Daniel Carter, and he did not open with threats or demands. He opened by asking, in a tone that struck me as genuinely puzzled, why an armed battle group had been sent after a vessel that had never fired a single weapon of its own. Counselor Sorn pressed him carefully, asking what exactly his ship had done to disable an entire fleet without visible weapons fire. Carter's answer, translated a moment later by our linguistic team, was almost unsettling in its simplicity. He said his ship carried standard defensive systems designed to prevent hostile vessels from operating nearby, and that those systems had done exactly what they were built to do, nothing more. I remember the room going very still after that translation was read aloud. Standard defensive systems, not a weapon built for conquest, not some rare and terrible device meant to demonstrate strength, a defensive measure, treated by its own operator as an unremarkable feature of an ordinary vessel. Carter went on to explain, when asked directly what kind of ship he commanded, that it was a border patrol vessel, tasked with monitoring quiet regions of human space and identifying unknown contacts before they became a larger concern. He said, almost gently, that he had not expected to encounter an armed fleet at all, and that his ship's systems had reacted to sustained hostile fire the way they were designed to, without any input on his part, beyond simply continuing forward. I watched several senior officials in that room exchange looks I had never seen among them before, a mixture of disbelief and something closer to dread. If this had truly been nothing more than a routine patrol craft, operating on automatic defensive protocols, then the 6 ships of Grath's picket fleet and the entire battle group built around the Ashkeld had not been defeated by anything humanity considered remarkable at all. Counselor Sorn asked the question that I suspect everyone in that chamber was silently forming in their own minds. She asked what a deliberately hostile human vessel, one built and intended for actual combat rather than simple patrol duty, might be capable of, if this had been the outcome of a ship that considered itself unremarkable. Carter did not answer that question directly. He said only that he hoped it would never become necessary to find out, and that he would prefer, personally, for this entire situation to end without further loss on either side. There was a strange kindness in his tone that unsettled me more than open hostility ever could have. It would have been easier, in some ways, to face an enemy who wanted our destruction, who spoke with pride or anger about the fleets they had crushed. Instead, we were facing someone who seemed almost uncomfortable with what his own ship had done, as though the deaths of 6 good officers and the loss of a heavy cruiser were an unfortunate accident rather than an achievement worth acknowledging. After the channel closed, the council session continued for several more hours, moving through the difficult, tense process of deciding how the Dominion should respond. Some officials argued for an immediate, overwhelming show of force, insisting that any hesitation now would be read by humanity as weakness. Others argued the opposite, pointing out quite reasonably that overwhelming force was precisely what we had already attempted, twice, with catastrophic results both times. Counselor Sorn, in the end, made the decision that would shape everything that followed. She proposed opening formal diplomatic contact with humanity, rather than pursuing further military action, a proposal that passed only after long, uncomfortable debate, and only because enough officials in that room understood, deep down, that pride was a poor reason to risk losing more ships, more crews, and more officers like Ilsa Grath and Varen Thale. I was assigned, in the final hour of that session, a task I did not feel remotely prepared for. Counselor Sorn asked me personally to prepare the Dominion's first official threat assessment on humanity, drawing on everything I had witnessed firsthand, from the quiet listening post above Callus Station to the wreckage of Grath's picket fleet to the final silence that swallowed the Ashkeld. I returned to my quarters that night with a blank document open in front of me and found, for the first time in my career, that I did not know how to begin. Every framework I had been trained to use for measuring a threat relied on numbers, on comparing weapons output, ship classes, fleet sizes, tactical doctrine. None of it applied cleanly to what I had actually witnessed, a species whose ordinary patrol craft, operating on unremarkable defensive settings, had quietly and almost gently dismantled everything the Dominion had sent against it. I stared at that blank page for a long time before finally writing a single line, one I would end up revising more times than I could count over the following days. Humanity's true capability remains unknown, and every indication we possess suggests we have not yet seen anything they would consider a genuine demonstration of strength. I saved the document and closed my console, and for the first time since this entire crisis began, I found myself dreading not the ship, not the silence, not the wreckage, but the simple, unavoidable task of trying to explain all of it clearly enough for people who had not been there to finally understand what I already knew in my bones. We were not facing an enemy who wanted war. We were facing an enemy who had never needed to consider it a real possibility. The threat assessment sat unfinished on my console for 11 days. I rewrote the opening section more times than I want to admit, each version feeling either too alarmed to be taken seriously by a council still clinging to old certainties, or too cautious to properly convey what I had actually witnessed. Every draft felt like a betrayal of something, either of the truth or of the fragile confidence still holding the Dominion together after 2 devastating losses in a row. I would write a paragraph, read it back, and hear Corin Hale's voice describing a silence that felt less like defeat and more like being gently, patiently looked at. No official language I had access to could properly hold that feeling. While I struggled with the report, preparations moved forward for the Dominion's first formal meeting with human representatives, arranged through the same channel that had first connected us to Daniel Carter. I was asked to attend as an observer, given my direct experience with the events leading up to this moment, and I accepted, though some part of me had hoped never to hear that calm, unhurried voice again. The meeting took place aboard a neutral station near the border, a place chosen specifically because it belonged to neither side, small and quiet, with none of the ceremonial grandeur usually reserved for encounters between powers. Councillor Sorn led the Dominion delegation herself, accompanied by 2 senior diplomats and myself, standing slightly apart from the main table, tasked with observing rather than speaking. The human delegation arrived without any of the display I half expected after everything I had witnessed. 2 representatives stepped through the docking corridor, dressed plainly, carrying nothing that suggested military rank or ceremonial authority. One introduced herself as Laura Bennett, a calm, measured woman who seemed to carry the conversation with an ease that felt almost disarming. The other was Daniel Carter himself, the same voice I had heard through a translated channel weeks earlier, now standing in front of me as an ordinary-looking man, unremarkable in every visible way, offering a polite greeting to Councillor Sorn, as though this were any routine diplomatic meeting rather than the aftermath of 2 shattered fleets. I remember watching him closely throughout that first exchange, searching for some sign of the ship's cold precision in the man who apparently commanded it, and finding nothing of the sort. He spoke carefully, listened without interrupting, and twice apologized directly for the loss of Dominion personnel, a gesture that struck several officials in that room as either deeply sincere or deeply strange, and possibly both at once. Bennett did most of the formal talking on the human side, explaining plainly that their vessel had been operating well within its normal parameters, and that the deaths on both sides of this encounter were something humanity genuinely regretted rather than celebrated. She explained, when pressed, that Carter's ship was not a specialized or experimental vessel of any kind, simply one of many standard patrol craft assigned to monitor the quieter edges of human territory, built with defensive systems considered ordinary by human military standards. I watched Councillor Sorn absorb that statement with the same stillness I remembered from the council chamber weeks earlier. If this had truly been an unremarkable patrol vessel, then the picture forming around humanity's actual military strength was far larger and far more uncertain than anyone in that room wanted to consider. Carter, for his part, seemed uninterested in using that fact to gain any advantage in the negotiation. When one of the Dominion diplomats asked, somewhat bluntly, what humanity's full military capability actually looked like, Carter answered with the same quiet honesty he had shown from the very beginning. He said he did not have authority to discuss classified specifications, but that he personally hoped such information would never need to become relevant between our two peoples. There was no threat hidden in that answer, and somehow that made it more unsettling than if there had been. I found myself thinking, as the negotiation continued, that an enemy who wanted to frighten us would have gladly listed their strengths, would have used this moment to establish dominance the way the Dominion itself might have done under similar circumstances. Instead, humanity seemed almost embarrassed by the entire situation, eager to move past it quietly rather than use it as leverage. The negotiations stretched across several long sessions over the following days, covering border boundaries, communication protocols, and a mutual agreement to avoid further armed contact without prior diplomatic contact first. Counselor Sorn handled her side with careful precision, clearly aware that the Dominion was negotiating from a position far weaker than anyone had believed possible only a few months earlier, though she never allowed that awareness to show openly at the table. I spent most of those sessions simply watching, taking notes I barely needed, since every detail of those meetings had already burned itself firmly into my memory. What struck me most, by the final session, was how ordinary the human representatives continued to seem throughout the entire process. They laughed occasionally at small moments of tension breaking during long discussions. Bennett once made a mild joke about the length of Dominion formal titles that even drew a brief surprised smile from one of our own diplomats. Carter, near the end of the final session, mentioned quietly that he hoped to return to simpler patrol duties once this was settled, as though commanding the vessel that had ended a battle group was nothing more than routine work he was eager to get back to. That ordinariness followed me home from the negotiations more than anything else. It would have been easier in some strange way to face a species that reveled in its own strength, that wanted to be feared and made sure everyone around them knew it. Instead, we had encountered something that seemed genuinely uninterested in being feared at all, treating overwhelming capability as an unremarkable feature of daily patrol work rather than a source of pride. When I finally returned to my quarters after the negotiations concluded, I opened the threat assessment I had left unfinished for so long and found that I still could not bring myself to complete it in the confident, structured language the Council expected. I wrote instead, as plainly as I knew how, that the true danger the Dominion faced was not a hostile fleet massing at our border, waiting to strike, but the quiet, unsettling possibility that we had, without meaning to, tested the edge of something we did not yet understand, and had been met not with fury, but with a patient, almost gentle correction, delivered without any apparent effort at all. I wrote that every officer who had died in the Cenis corridor and aboard the Ashkeld had not fallen to a weapon built for cruelty, but to a system built for simple defense, operated by people who seemed to regret the outcome as much as we mourned it. And I wrote, in the final line I ever added to that report, that the Dominion's oldest and most comfortable belief, the quiet certainty that we understood our place among the powers of this region of space, had ended the moment a single, unremarkable patrol vessel drifted into a corridor it had never intended to threaten in the first place. I never submitted a fully polished version of that report. Counselor Sorn accepted it exactly as it stood, unfinished in tone if not in content, understanding perhaps better than I did at the time that some truths do not need to be smoothed over to be taken seriously. A few weeks later, I requested a transfer away from frontline intelligence work, and it was granted without argument or question. I was not the only officer to make that request in the aftermath of everything that had happened. I told myself it was simply time for a change, that 11 years reading light and static had worn me down in ordinary, unremarkable ways. The truth, which I have only fully admitted to myself since, is quieter than that. Somewhere between the silence over Cenis corridor and the calm, apologetic voice of Daniel Carter sitting across a negotiation table, I lost the ability to look at the stars the way I once had, as a wide, dangerous, but ultimately knowable space that the Dominion understood and in some careful way controlled. Now, Whenever I look up at that same sky, I find myself wondering instead what an ordinary human patrol officer considers an actual fight, and I have never once found an answer that lets me sleep easily afterward. That question, more than any weapon or wreckage I ever documented, is the reason I chose to step away and let someone else carry the burden of watching humanity's quiet, patient edge from here.